This morning, Old Brown woke up earlier than usual. For some time, he smiled because he dreamed of his former life, his big cozy house, wonderful garden, and sweet wife. Previously, Patrick Brown was a happy family man, lived in a decent place, and peacefully lived out his old age. But at one moment, everything changed. A terrible fire destroyed his house, and he lost his wife. Only Brown and his faithful dog Loki survived in that fire. Patrick's legs were severely burned, and he could only walk on crutches. The poor dog also got burned and was now very afraid of fire. Unfortunate Loki was shaking even when the old man would light a match to light his pipe. Patrick often regretted that he did not leave with his wife. It was so hard and bitter for him now to exist. He recently turned 72 and often wondered what lay ahead of him. After the fire, Patrick faced human injustice and callousness. The insurance company refused to reimburse the damage completely, and the old man had no one to turn to. All the many friends who often visited the Browns suddenly turned their backs on Patrick. Previously, Mr. Brown helped many, but when he needed help, it suddenly turned out that he was utterly alone. Patrick had a son, but communication with him was interrupted long before the accident, and even after the fire, his son blamed him for not being able to save his mother. Now, Oldie Brown lived in an abandoned trailer in a small forest near the town. No one lived nearby. The old man was alone and talked only to his dog. They had taken this dog from the shelter with his wife, so Loki reminded Patrick of his beloved wife. Patrick Brown remembered all the recent events, and the smile faded from his face. The day started with nothing good. His legs poorly hurt after the fire. The sun shone from the early hours, and strong heat waves began to heat up the metallic trailer. There was stuffiness all around the old man. The old man tried to move his legs. It still hurt to move. Loki immediately approached him and buried his muzzle into his palm. The dog was worried about his owner. Patrick stroked the dog and sat up in bed with difficulty. On that day, he was going to the city to send another letter to his son. The old man hoped that his son was just on a long trip, and one day he would read his father's letters and come to him. Brown was also worried about his dog. If he died, then what would happen to the dog? Because he would disappear. Old Brown cooked a simple meal and shared it with the dog. Patrick dressed in decent clothes and took a bag in which he put a letter and some money to buy food in the city. The dog always accompanied Patrick when he went to the town. It went with the owner on this day, too. The path was long and ran through the forest. It was challenging to move on crutches on a grumpy road. His old wounds began to bleed, but Old Brown tried not to pay attention to them. He needed to send a letter. The sun was merciless. Patrick looked at the sky. There was not a cloud. The old man was already far away from his trailer when he saw a small group of young people. Brown habitually ordered the dog to walk close to him. Young people saw an old man on crutches with disfigured legs and a dog with visible burn marks from the fire. For some reason, they thought it was amusing. Enticing each other, the guys made jokes about the old man's appearance and made fun of his dog. But Patrick did not answer, pretended not to hear their ridicule. He only wanted to quickly pass this company and reach the city. One of the guys got so cocky that he pushed the old man. Patrick Brown lost his balance and fell straight into the hot dust on the road. Faithful Loki pounced on the offender and bit him by the hand. Getting angry with this, the young people began to kick the dog and then attack the old man. Patrick yelled at them not to hit the dog, but the guys didn't listen. The old man covered his head with his hands, receiving blows to his body. A terrible wave of horror and resentment filled his heart, because Patrick had done nothing wrong to them, and he might not be able to send his letter to his son. Not even the pain of his bleeding foot could compare to that feeling of being lost in his pain. After beating the old man and his dog up, the guys picked up and shook out Brown's bag. A few dollars and a letter fell out from it. The young people took the money, and they threw the letter and the bag far into the bushes. Then the young lads laughed with joy and left. Old Brown lay in the dust for a long time, gathering his strength. Finally, he raised his head and softly called out to Loki. The dog was also beaten up for good. She limped over to her master and began to lick his face, whimpering softly. Loki felt guilty for not protecting his master. Brown stroked the dog, comforting her, and said that Loki was not to blame for anything. These young people were disasters, just as merciless and without human feelings. Brown asked the dog to look for the letter. It was unlikely that the guys had taken it. The dog understood the command and began searching. Finally, her joyful barking was heard from the bushes. Loki found the letter. The old man sat down and began looking for crutches. One was closer, the other lay far away. Brown crawled up to the first crutch. Loki saw that the old man was looking for a crutch and dragged the second of them to him. Patrick examined his crutches and thanked God that the young people had not broken them. Loki led the old man to his things. Patrick struggled to pick up the letter and bag from the ground. The bag was all dirty, and the letter was crumpled and also had dusty traces. But the old man did not give up the idea of going to the city. He did not want to give up and return to the trailer. This letter contained his hope. Patrick Brown and his dog walked on through the forest, which was getting thicker. There was an unusual silence. Birds usually would sing, but this time they were silent. This alarmed the old man. He thought trouble might be ahead. After all, the sun was beating down so hard that it could start a forest fire. Suddenly, Loki began to whine loudly and asked to go home. He grabbed the old man by the clothes with his teeth and pulled him in the opposite direction. After a few feet, Brown realized why the dog behaved restlessly, and he smelled burnt. A moment later, the old man saw intense smoke ahead and flashes of fire. There was a fire in front of them. Loki was very scared. It already knew the fire and was very scared. The dog began to tremble. Its legs began to be removed from fear. The old man petted the dog and went back to the trailer. A menacing crack and the terrible silence of the forest accompanied their path. There was more and more smoke, and it began to clog into their lungs, pinching their eyes. The old man was in a hurry, and because of that, his every step on crutches along the time went astray, and it turned out to move slowly. Brown feared not so much for himself as for his faithful dog. After a while, when the smoke filled almost the entire space in the forest, the old man could no longer walk his way back, and the fire got closer to them. There was a terrible dryness in his throat, and the old man regretted that he had not thought to take at least a bottle of water with him. His eyes were watering from the smoke. At some point, the old man realized he could not get out, but it was necessary to save the dog and send his last letter to his son. Patrick Brown leaned against a tree and breathed heavily. He called his dog and began to tell her to run to the city. Loki was an intelligent dog and would be able to get out. The old man tore off the handles from the bag and tied the letter around the dog's neck so the paper could be seen enough. Patrick hoped people would see this handmade collar and take the letter. Brown looked directly into the eyes of his dog and told her to run to the post office. So he repeated the word mail several times. Loki ran away from the old man, whining and returning to the owner over and over again. Loki was afraid to leave him there alone. The old man waved his hand, indicating that the dog should run faster. Patrick looked at his dog for a long time. He sat down near the tree and dutifully waited for either his death or salvation. He started falling into oblivion and saw his former life again. Everything there was flooded with light. Happy laughter was heard, his wife was still alive, and he was young and full of strength. A terrible crack woke the old man. The huge old tree that stood nearby, unable to withstand the power of the fire, began to fall. The heavy trunk broke thinner trees, flames danced on the bark and gnawed at the thin branches. The old man watched in horror as the fire got closer and closer. Healed burns ached even more. His body still remembered the fire that had deprived him of his former life. and now the fire has returned as if it came for another portion of his life and wanted to take the old man himself. Patrick Brown saw the inevitability of disastrous fire. If he had not met those young folks, he would have reached the city by now and been safe. But alas, he lost a lot of time and was beaten by them and could not move so fast that time. The old man no longer understood whether he felt the bitterness of the acrid smoke or whether it was human cruelty that was eating away his soul. Brown had one hope, that his Loki would remain alive and kind people would pick it up or even return to the shelter. Anything was better than dying there in the fire. And if you were lucky, Loki would be able to take his letter to the post office. The old man wanted that letter to reach his son so that he would know what happened to his parents. The fire was already surrounding the old man as if it was mocking him. Now he was pouring heat on his face. He stepped back, obeying the air currents. Suddenly, through the crackling, a loud barking was heard. Brown immediately recognized the voice of his dog. But why did Loki return? After all, he had to flee to the city. The old man began to cry. He realized that now the faithful dog would die with him, and with both of them, the hope of passing the letter to his son would die. The bark was getting closer. The old man wanted to shout for Loki to run away, leaving him there, but instead of words, only a wheeze came out of his mouth. Strong smoke had already intercepted his throat, not allowing him to say a word. Right through the fire, overcoming his fear, Loki jumped and began to lick Brown's face, and again he began to bark loudly as if calling for someone. Two men followed the dog through the fire. They were people from the forest, possibly lumberjacks. They picked up the old man and began to carry him out of the woods. Behind them, wagging his tail, Loki was running. The dog was happy that it was able to help his master. The old man silently cried. He did not even have the strength to thank his saviors. The lumberjacks took the old man straight to the city post office. Brown shook hands with them and thanked them in a low, smoke-hoarse voice. And so, Patrick Brown ended up at the post office. With trembling hands, he took the letter from his dog and dropped it into the mailbox. Nick and Paul are brothers, but have always been different. Their age difference was 6 years, but their characters differed significantly. Nick started walking and talking early. He was admired by relatives and teachers at school, who also adored him. Nick was given all the things he needed. He excelled in the exact sciences in school. He quickly learned languages. Music teachers praised him. He was obedient and exemplary, and never had behavioral problems. Nick was successful in everything he undertook. He was sent to piano lessons early ages. He graduated from high school with flying colors. At the same time, he also mastered the guitar and violin. He performed at all school parties. Girls fell in love with him from an early age. Paul was born 6 years later. It was immediately apparent that the younger son differed significantly from the eldest. Paul started walking late. He categorically did not want to talk until the age of 4. Nick enjoyed eating healthy porridge. Paul demanded chocolate and sweets, although he had not yet mastered human speech. Nick slept soundly even as an infant. He didn't give his parents trouble. Paul screamed at night, and his mother sometimes regretted that she had given birth to a second child. The eldest son was always praised. They spoke about the youngest son with regret. The boy was hired a nanny, but she could not stand the stress that the restless baby brought to her. When he started to walk, he categorically did not want to obey rules. Nick was constantly held up as an example to Paul. Since infancy, he could not stand his lucky brother. Years passed. The attention of the girls surrounded Nick. He played the guitar very well. He could perform any popular song on guitar and win hearts. He was a welcome guest at any party. He had a lot of admirers. Also, he had a delicate taste. He always looked clean and neat. The girls considered him an enviable groom. Paul changed nannies constantly. No nanny could stand the boy's behavior. He often broke dishes and often freaked out in screams. Paul was in a lot of pain. In all his childhood photographs, he had disgusting snot. He started going to the potty late. His father and mother never raised a hand against Nick. Paul was spanked for every miss he had done. And there were many misdeeds in his behavior. A lot. The teachers at school couldn't stand the guy. He went to the same school as his brother. Teachers constantly compared the two brothers. They wondered how two completely different people could be born into the same family. At school, Paul was constantly bullied by his classmates, but soon the bullying stopped. The guy started fighting early. Nobody wanted to be associated with him. Many teachers said that only prison awaited him in the future. Paul hated Nick. Nick didn't hate his brother. Sometimes he even sympathized a little with him, but he didn't feel much love for him. Nick valued his reputation. The younger brother significantly damaged his reputation. Nick wanted to be a member of the perfect family. Parents fit into the picture of an ideal family, and Paul was a dirty spot in this family. Years passed. Nick had the first girl with whom he wanted to build a serious relationship. But when their mother saw Nick was in love with an ordinary girl, she decided to think twice. It seemed to her that Nick needed someone else, someone with a slightly higher social status. She was annoyed by Nick's feelings for a girl from a simple family. Isla was a nice girl. She looked lovingly at the intelligent and handsome guy. Nick reciprocated her. Sometimes his mother thought that Isla would have been more suitable for her goofy youngest son. Oh yes, mother would be happy to see Paul with Isla. The girls didn't like Paul. He had difficulty moving from class to class. He studied badly. He often interrupted classes. At home, his father's flogging awaited him every time. He learned to hate everyone. Bad relationships in the family led the guy into bad company. He started drinking and soon lost a large sum of money in gambling. He hid his debts from his parents. He knew they would never help him. At first, Paul tried to win back his money. He sold the gifts he received from his parents and his grandmother. The guys who demanded that Paul repay his debt as soon as possible hinted that he could take his mother's jewelry. They would be enough to pay off the debt. But he could not cross the line. Paul loved his parents. He combined love and hatred for those who were in his family. He dreamed of being like Nick. He wanted to see, in his mother's eyes, the same pride she felt for her eldest son. But all the rounds of applause went to Nick. All the pride went to his older brother. One terrible night, Paul was severely beaten. The guys told the gangsters that a guy owed them money. Anxious parents arrived at the hospital. The father demanded an explanation of why this happened to him. Paul thought bitterly that it was not his condition that worried his parents, but the problems he caused them. He felt that it would be easier for his father and mother if he were killed. Under his father's gaze, Paul admitted that he was beaten for his debts in gambling. His father didn't even scold him. He gave his son a contemptuous look. Later, his parents decided to help their youngest son at home at a family council. Nick objected. He believed that family money should not have gone to support an irresponsible villain. The parents were saving up some money for their eldest son to buy a separate apartment. Nick was furious that all the savings were spent on the youngest son. Paul had a lot of debt. His father found out the total amount and paid off the debts. Nick began to hate his brother even more. Paul felt guilty. Guilt gnawed at him. But still, his parents' attitude killed his sincerity in him. The father called his son to talk when the guy got recovered. The amount that the parents spent on Paul's debts was huge. His father said he had to work hard to return the money. Paul looked at his father in amazement. The amount was so large that it might take several years to repay. And then there was college. His father said that Paul would have to leave for hard work instead of college. A massive construction project was going on in the next town. Strong young people were being recruited there with 3 years contracts. Under the agreement, the workers were fed and provided with work clothes, but they were paid money only after the construction was completed. No loving parent would send their child there, but Paul's father believed the youngest son had to work off the debt that way. Paul was even more disappointed in his parents, but he wasn't bright enough to finish college. He had no plans for the future. So he agreed to the conditions. He thought about how nice it was to not see his parents and Nick for several years, and it was an excellent chance to pay off the debt. The departure of the unloved son took place quickly. Nobody said kind words to him. His mother didn't even kiss Paul goodbye. Nick didn't even talk to his brother, who was away for 3 years. His father briefly wished his son good luck and warned him not to get involved in more problems. The old bus took Paul away from home. The work at the construction site was tricky. He did not expect such difficult working conditions. Food was scarce. His clothes were always dirty. They worked for 60 hours a week in hot and cold weather. His legs and back hurt. Many could not stand it and went home, giving up. But Paul had nowhere to go. To his surprise, he was drawn into the work with his head. The result was challenging and exhausting, but the guy quickly learned to make it easier for himself. He thought for a long time about why there was such a poor work organization at such a large-scale construction. Once the construction manager, Mr. Smith, visited the site. Paul mustered up his courage and approached the chief. Mr. Smith was surprised at the guy's courage, but listened to him. He did not answer his suggestions, but it was clear that the words of the bold young builder made him think. The following day, Mr. Smith brought together the leaders of the construction teams and instructed them to make changes according to Paul's idea. After the meeting, he called the head of the detachment where Paul worked and said the guy should be encouraged. Paul was not just encouraged, he got a real promotion. His work was not so hard now, but he had to work with his brain instead. He heard praises addressed to him for the first time in his miserable life. After a year of hard work, his body became lean, strong, and muscular. His appearance became attractive. There was no exhausting work in the new position for him, but it took a lot of thinking and planning. The guy started reading books about his niche. Knowledge gave him an impetus for new ideas in construction. He became so bold that he called Mr. Smith to talk one day. It was surprising, but John Smith willingly agreed to the meeting. Paul's ideas seemed very reasonable to him. After this conversation, Smith thought the guy's brilliant brain would be helpful to him, not just at a construction site. He offered the guy to work in his office in an excellent managerial position. John Smith was surprised that the guy had no education. He was ready to pay for his college by signing a new contract. Under the agreement, Paul had to work for his company after all the years of research and another 5 years after graduation. The salary offered was high above the average. Paul didn't immediately agree. He could not believe in his strength and mental abilities for a long time. From an early age, he was told he was irresponsible and unlucky. He hardly thought that he could succeed in things. But John Smith, a prominent construction company owner, believed in him. Father, mother, and brother did not believe in Paul, but the millionaire businessman believed in him. The guy agreed to the terms of his boss. His career developed rapidly. The guy became a member of the house of a successful chef. Soon he met John Smith's daughter. He was in no hurry to start a relationship with her. Paul believed that he was unworthy of a beautiful girl from a wealthy family. Stephanie was terrific and educated on the other side. She liked a handsome guy with a muscular physique. All her childhood, her parents inspired her that the main thing in a person is his personal qualities. She was many times made marriage proposals by guys who pursued selfish goals. Her admirers were the spoiled sons of wealthy parents. Her father did not forbid her to make her own choice, but he warned against such a relationship. But when Stephanie fell in love with Paul, her father approved this choice. 6 months later, in a new job, Paul sent his parents the money he owed them. He sent him an even more considerable sum. And 6 months later, Paul married and invited the whole family to the wedding. Mother and father came to a magnificent wedding. They were surprised at how their youngest son had changed. Mother cried and constantly wanted to kiss and hug Paul. In his father's eyes, Paul saw the very pride he had dreamed of getting since his childhood. Also, Stephanie's family became his family. His wife was proud of him. Her father was proud of him. The entire Smith family respected and loved him. Paul did not show that he was indifferent to the feelings of his mother and father. He greeted them warmly and asked why Nick hadn't come. The guy was surprised that the older brother did not attend the wedding, and he was also surprised that the parents were reluctant to talk about the eldest son. After the wedding, his mother and father left for their city. Before parting, they begged Paul to come to them more often. Paul promised, but he knew he would not keep the promise. He wanted to know one thing: his brother. A few months later, Paul and his young wife arrived in their hometown. He knew that his parents had bought his brother an apartment. Paul called his brother and was surprised Nick was glad to see him. But before visiting his brother, he nevertheless visited his parents. The father told his youngest son a heartbreaking story. Nick graduated from college, but was unable to work in his field. He considered himself more intelligent than his superiors, commented to his leaders, and could not hold on to any job. He criticized colleagues, and other employees did not like him. His mother was able to separate Nick from his first love. Nick experienced this shallowness very hard and began to drink. He had no friends because Nick believed that they were unworthy of him. He listened to classical music and read books, and even his friends worked, earned money, and built their families. The women Nick liked didn't even look at him. Nick spent his evenings alone at the piano or with the violin. Every evening he drank alcohol, played music for himself, and hated the whole world. The world was unfair to him. That's what the guy thought. At first, Nick's parents supported him, but he could not forgive them that they spent a large amount on the debts of their younger brother, and this amount was enough to buy Nick a house. Even once he stole jewelry from his mother and sold them. Nick believed that everyone was unfair to him. He was glad to see Paul. Nick was sure that luck fell on his unlucky brother by accident. He expected to see that stupid guy, but with money? He planned to ask his brother for money and perhaps for a good job. Their meeting shocked both. Nick stopped being a handsome guy. From daily drinking, his skin became flabby and wrinkled. The guy no longer had that proud posture. Nick looked older and tired of life, tired of everything. But there was still a twinkle of arrogance in his eyes. When he saw his younger brother, he was shocked. Paul looked robust, young, and lucky. Next to him was a beautiful woman. Nick felt terrible envy, looking at his brother's wife. The brothers hugged. Paul refused to drink. Nick began to complain to his brother about his fate. His apartment was dirty. Paul wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. Stephanie felt a little sick. She was in her second month of pregnancy. Nick worriedly invited Stephanie to lie down. The older brother asked Paul for money, but Paul replied, "Nick, I won't give you money. I'll try to get you a job, but you won't get a prestigious position right now. My company values experience and the ability to work. Also, I see your empty fridge. I will go to the store and buy you some groceries." Nick was expecting something different. Even greater envy and malice settled in his soul. Paul left the apartment, and Stephanie fell asleep on Nick's uncleaned couch. Nick looked at the sleeping girl, and his desire to possess her grew. She was beautiful and rich. He thought for a long time about how unfair life was to him. Paul had been a non-entity since childhood. Stephanie just doesn't know what a real man is, thought Nick. And he went to the sofa where his brother's wife lay. He caressed the sleeping girl and put his hand under her blanket. Stephanie immediately woke up, screaming and fighting back, but Nick used force. Paul was already approaching the apartment with food packages. Hearing screams, he hurried to his brother's apartment. These were the cries of his beloved wife. The door was open. In a minute, Paul pushed Nick away from Stephanie and sat his wife in a chair. With one blow, his brother fell unconscious. Nick fell to the floor and began to squeal in pain. Paul called the police. Nick didn't harm Stephanie and the baby much, but he left a few bruises on her arm. These traces were enough for the police to record the attempted violence. The neighbors heard the fact that the girl loudly called for help. Nick was taken to the police. He was sentenced to prison for attempted rape. The parents of Nick and Paul did not help their eldest son. They finally realized how unfair they were to their youngest child. Soon, a girl was born in Paul's family. Paul's parents wanted to babysit their granddaughter. They tried to get close to their youngest son, but Paul did not want to communicate with them. Finally, he understood one important thing from his life. He believed that his parents betrayed him many years ago. Now, he considered his family, Stephanie, and his baby.